So 5 facts. Number 1, earlier this year, Bombardier suffered a cybersecurity breach. We know that much. 2, the company acknowledged the attack after some of its data surfaced on a hacker's web portal. 3, confidential information relating to employees, customers, and suppliers were compromised, and the manufacturing and customer support operations have not been impacted or interrupted. 4, an initial investigation revealed that the hackers accessed and extracted data by exploiting a vulnerability affecting a third-party file transfer application. Many security experts think the attack is part of the, I always say this wrong, so I apologize, Accellion, let me get it? Accellion supply chain breach. Accellion has urged its customers to migrate away from the vulnerable FTA web server that appears to have resulted in 100 companies being attacked and data stolen from 25 of them thus far. So that's our little summary for Bombardier. And my first question is going to go to David Millet. So legacy applications seem to pose a huge threat when it comes to protecting the enterprise. With so many large corporations having a notoriously difficult time upgrading and keeping up to date with applications, how can corporations fast track themselves to safety? And is this even possible?
It's a very good question. The reality is that when you look at the complexity of the infrastructures that exist today, so organizations in the past had very monolithic sort of applications that were put in place, mainframes and a couple of client server type applications that would connect. And, then with the arrival of, from 1995 onwards, the internet started booming and things started changing, and interoperability and connected systems via the internet started happening, and, microservices and everything that we know that is the world today with the cloud coming into play opened up the fact that even though you had your organization had its own systems, it became more and more critical to interact and tie these systems to external environments. And with that naturally comes risk. The other thing is, in the case of this particular breach, we're talking about a system that was acquired and used to store shared files and information with the customers and with their individuals. So it kind of had a limitation on what was leaked because it was held within one specific area and not necessarily connected to the internal systems. But whatever was on that system could have been better controlled as far as what's allowed to be shared and what's the expiration on shared dates and monitoring of those systems, right? In the case of this attack, it's unfortunate. It was a zero-day breach and a problem that happened within the system that allowed hackers to get into that system and steal information from not just Bombardier, but a lot of other organizations, as you mentioned. So it's important to stay abreast and aware of these zero-day attacks. There's also systems that can be put in place to protect against that, be it web access firewalls and things of that nature that'll sort of mitigate attacks when 0 days vulnerabilities are identified. I often say that whatever human beings put together as a vault to protect themselves, there's always people that are going to attack that vault. So you have to always be on the lookout and evolving your methodology and the tools that you use to defend against those different things. And I guess I'll leave it at that because we've got a lot of other topics to go into. So don't want to steal the thunder of everybody over here.
I see that Julien has something to add to it, but just before we get to Julien, you said zero-day attack. Can you just explain what that is for people in the audience?
Well, yeah, a zero-day vulnerability. Basically, what that means is it's a vulnerability that's identified in the wild that's new, that's not necessarily defended against, and it's brought to light often by ethical hackers or things of that nature that bring them to light and say there's a problem over here. And unfortunately, when that happens, it's good because it allows the organizations to start creating patches and fixing against that. But a zero-day vulnerability often doesn't have a physical patch yet available in the software to fix it. So what that means, it implies that you either got to close down the system, defend yourself against it, put up guard doors or firewalls or so forth around that, because the vulnerability is not patched until the organization has the ability to go ahead and fix it, right? So you'll hear a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities around BIOS and operating systems and so forth. That's the reason that we have security patch updates from Windows that annoy us all once a month, if not once a week. I know they're annoying, but they're important to do because that's exactly how hackers get in, right? It's when we don't update our systems that we leave all these doors open. And unfortunately, it's often through these little things that they get in, and then they're able to navigate our systems and, you know, cause damage.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. And if anyone else has any more questions, just be sure to, when you're writing in the chat, to write to the panelists and the attendees so that everyone can see your questions. Julien, you had something to add?
Yeah, well, thank you, David, for the 0-day explanation. It's in that case, what is, and on my end, I call this unfinished software. Let's say most of the time they have to release the software, let's say Microsoft or Oracle or these big guys. And it's not time sensitive, but because of the investor in the back end, they want to push the release and the software quickly. So that's where happened the 0-day. But in that case, the Accellion FTA, which stands for File Transfer Services, was 20 years old technology. So to find a 0-day in that kind of stuff, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's a interesting fact. That's what I wanted to add.
That's great.
Yeah, well, I mean, the zero, you're right in the fact that you know, organizations are under pressure to release software faster. But the other notion of a 0-day is that, you know, like, for example, every week there's 0-day vulnerabilities that are uncovered, right? Because although, you know, as a tester, our goal is often to test everything that we can, you know, we could test forever and still continue to find potential bugs and anomalies and problems within the software, or certain vulnerabilities that are uncovered through new methodologies or approaches that are used to get in, right? Whether that's DDoS attacks or, you know, putting a system under stress to find a weakness or so forth. That's the, you know, that's the challenge, right? As much as we put up walls to defend against ourselves, as much as the attackers are challenged by those walls to want to find a way to get around them, under them, over them, you know, and into our systems. And, you know, it's funny because you don't necessarily need to be a very big organization to be under potential threat right now, right? There's organizations of all sizes that are, you know, held for ransomware, things of that nature, that are often, you look and you dig in, there's often two root causes, right? It's either an individual maliciously, or often just by not knowing that he's communicating with somebody that he shouldn't, that's sharing information or providing things that could cause a problem, or in a lot of cases, it's a mispatched system or, you know, misupdated firmware on something that is being leveraged by the hackers to get in by a side door that was unfortunately not closed, right? Once the 0-day vulnerability has been addressed.
I think that's super important to mention how people can get in, because that's what people can focus on. And you mentioned 3 of them, so thank you for that. So if anyone has questions for David or Julien, who's talked so far, just let us know in the chat. But right now, I want to shift gears here. And Vanessa, you might have to help me. So before I ask you this question, can you define IPEDA? Did I get it? Oh yeah. And CPPA Act. What are they? And then I'm going to ask you my question.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I'm just going to go back a little bit to be sure that we're all on the same page. So maybe a crash course regarding to how law works in Canada. So as you may know, because of our constitution, so the parliament can legislate on a federal level or provincial level, right? So regarding privacy, there's privacy laws at a federal level because of the commercial activities, which is regarding to the constitution under federal rights to legislate. And we can also have privacy legislation on a provincial level because of the civil rights, which pertains to provincial level, okay? So in Canada, we're having privacy laws at a federal level and at a provincial level. So IPEDA is the federal law for the private sector, because again, there's law in the private sector, and then you also have privacy laws for the public sector. So IPEDA is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. So basically, it's the privacy law that will give guidance and requirements for the private sector that are within the scope of this legislation. So mainly all the provinces except Quebec, Alberta, and BC will be subject to IPEDA in the private sector. And CPPA stands for Consumer Privacy Protection Act, but it's not a law at the moment. You probably heard about the Bill C-11. So eventually Bill C-11, so CPPA, will replace IPEDA. So I don't know if it answer the question, but
No, that was a great breakdown for everybody. Now we're all professionals here in IPEDA. Oh man, I keep saying it wrong. Anyway, so what I want to address is that in this situation from Bombardier, enterprise, employee, and supplier and customer data were stolen. So does that mean that IPEDA and now CPPA are in effect here or not?
Okay, so again, CPPA is not a law at the moment. So it's going to be IPEDA. If we're talking about Bombardier, so depending on where the data comes from, so if you have data from people from Quebec, from Ontario, from BC, from Alberta, then you're going to have different privacy laws applying to that specific case. So IPEDA will be the law to look to if there's personal information from people from Ontario, New Brunswick, other provinces where they don't have their specific privacy law. And you need to keep in mind that privacy laws will apply only to personal information. So if there's other type of data that don't qualify as personal information, then it's out of scope of IPEDA.
That's very interesting. Only personal information. So anything related to company information is not protected under this.
Not under IPEDA.
Okay, perfect.
No. So it's really personal information. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anything related to an individual. So, you know, names. I mean, the definition is very broad. So anything that can permit you to identify someone directly or indirectly is what we call personal information.
Mm-hmm. So just a follow-up question here. In this case, they only came out with a statement once the data and all this information was found on the web. So is Bombardier legally obligated to inform the company stakeholders that this happened, that there was a breach and that information did get stolen?
I would say that it depends. So it depends if there is a mandatory notification, if there is a privacy breach. At the moment, there's only a mandatory notification obligation if you're covered by IPEDA, BC, no, not BC, I think federal and Alberta. So there's only 2 privacy laws in Canada that have that obligation to notify. So if you have a breach, for example, the Bombardier one, you need to see where are your data, like is it data from Ontarians people, from Quebec people, and then you need to look at the privacy law. Do you have an obligation for that? So that's one thing. Then you may have agreements with other stakeholders, partners, even if it's not the law. In your agreement, you could say that, you know, if you're subject to a privacy breach or to a breach, you need to notify that partner. So that's also something you need to keep in mind.
Super important for everyone in this chat right now. And we also have a question from the attendees from Anne-Marie. She said, what if you collect data from outside of Canada?
Well, that's a good question. Then you need to assess what are the other privacy laws. So you probably heard about GDPR, which is the law in Europe. There's also privacy laws around the world, you know, in like China, in South America, and Brazil. So you really need to know what data was breached from which country, and then to determine what are the legal requirements, etc.
Okay, so it really determines on if you're end user, it depends on whatever country they're in, not necessarily where you're in.
Exactly.
Super important. Okay, awesome. So I want to ask David Leonard, in this case for Bombardier, would the insurance have responded?
Yeah, I think Vanessa raised some as well as David, into some important points and some key takeaways, and I'll kind of correlate that to the insurance world in terms of how the risk transfer takes place. Historically, I think what we've seen is that, again, the number of breaches we don't see, we've seen now really an evolution of what can be covered under insurance policy. And I'll just highlight quickly what it is, and I'll come back to certain points throughout our discussion throughout this afternoon. But really the insurance policy there is to respond. One, we look at it in 3 kind of portions. One, there's the element of the crisis management. So the onset, it brings forth the team, covers the cost for the team to come manage the incident. And with what Vanessa points out is that if we do see an element of data that's personal or data that has been exfiltrated, one of the first callers, what you'd want to be touching base with her to see what, from a regulatory standpoint, what you're liable for and help mitigate that. And then calling on for Julian and David to come in and to any investigative work to determine really what was affected, what do we do to mitigate this breach, kind of reduce that exposure. And that whole element there is kind of falls within the crisis management. Then there's the direct damages that occur, so potentially loss of revenue. If there's an element of an extortion, restoration of data, those costs there are also covered by the reimbursable on an insurance policy. And all this work is really done to try and mitigate the liability portion of it. And that's where Vanessa is suggesting that, we're starting to see, specifically in Canada, that we're starting to see some strict rules starting to fall with GDPR from that aspect. And these elements are also recoverable on an insurance policy, one, to defend these allegations, and as well as if there's any fines or penalties that are imposed. I think there's some key also takeaways from the Bombardier case. One, it talks about the supply chain. I think there is also, we talk about now regulatory standpoint and legislation, but there's also others that are still in force. For instance, Bombardier is also a defense manufacturer. So the Department of Defense in the US has strict guidelines now in terms of what protocol and what tools are implemented to mitigate those controls. At the same time, looking down the whole supply chain, just to the individual manufacturer, small mom and pop shop that is manufacturing the nuts and bolts that end up on a defense vehicle, there's regulation that could be imposed on that. And so we've really seen an evolution on that aspect. And I think that's something to really take in consideration is that, yes, you are also vulnerable as an organization, but also who you're doing business with. And that's where I think Vanessa also raised that we're starting to see this kind of element of what happens now in contracts and say, well, what happens if you incur a breach? When are you going to notify me? At what point do you notify me? And I think that's there as well as that in terms of that, the legal aspect comes to play in terms of Vanessa, but also the insurance team from respect to putting together the team that's going to help you notify, how we're going to notify that, really to reduce the potential damages from a liability aspect.
Thank you, David. So I actually have a question from the audience. It's a little bit lengthy, so I'm going to read it out to you. Are insurance underwriters beginning to insist that tools and policies are followed by the insured companies? Example, insisting on multiple factor authentication, documented patching, and update policies, implementation of security tools, etc. Or in other words, are we going to be seeing more insurance companies deny claims if they don't feel the company took appropriate steps to prevent the breach? Did the breach at Bombardier have ITAR ramifications?
No, that's a separate question. That's a separate question.
Yeah, that was a separate one. I can answer the first one. It's lengthy, but it's a really good and
it's a good one.
Very topical question that we're starting to see. And I'm able to give you a perspective coming from the underwriting side, but as well as now on the brokerage side in terms of direct access to client and how we put together an underwriting proposal and a risk and looking and evaluate the solutions that we're able to obtain from the various markets. From an underwriting standpoint, I think historically it's nothing new in terms of the coverage. What we've seen is the evolution in terms of very competitive markets. So underwriting guidelines became very lax just because a lot of new markets wanted to get into it, build a book of business, a portfolio. But now we start to see that the claims are starting to ramp up, and now we start seeing back underwriting questions to be as strict as they were, 10 years ago when this kind of, from that standpoint, when we were starting offering this more on a monoline basis. Historically, cyber insurance kind of followed more for technology-driven companies, and now it's pretty much, as we can see, organizations from healthcare down to a manufacturer of widgets, it can be affected. That said, I don't think we're at a scenario in time where we're start seeing denial of claims. That's always a concern. That's always, again, speaking with who's your broker in terms of choice of carrier. That all comes to a play in terms of that confidence. I always welcome the idea with clients that there is kind of an onboarding call with the underwriter as well as the client to go through these kind of questions. But what I would say is that we start seeing now certain language associated with it, because at the end of the day, the risk transfer solution really comprises of completing an application, which is essentially a balance sheet in time. But we can say that, yeah, my system is updated today, but what about 3 months from now? And I didn't do my patch sequence. I didn't do the cadence and all that. and we find out that there was in fact a vulnerability. We're starting to see some carriers to start put more exclusionary language around that. So if you didn't do the necessary to support your systems throughout, or you knew that you had a legacy system, but you knew it, but why didn't you make sure that it was not online? And I think that comes down to, you know, the work of David and Julie in terms of when they're communicating with their clients is, you know, making sure that you have a repertoire of all your you know, from your laptops to the software you're using, what's the cadence, and that comes down to it. So I think, you know, I don't think we're at a scenario where we're starting to see denial of claims. I think we'll see some tighter underwriting, but also we're starting to see in terms of underwriters starting to pull back on the amount of capacity that they're willing to offer, so the amount of limits, as well as playing around with certain language around it in the policy. So I think it's important. You know, it's never fun to read these type of policies, but to definitely reach out to go through that, it's something to look at closely.
Thank you, David, for that response, and thank you, Peter, for that question. We have David Millet, who also wants to contribute to this question before you get to the second question. So, David, all yours.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that as a provider of services in the space to various companies, I can tell you that at least in two key industries, being energy as well as financials, we are being asked to produce our disaster recovery and our security measures that are you know, being taken from our perspective as far as how we handle their data and how we treat things with regards to when we actively engage with production systems that have sensitive data, right? You know, do background checks to ensure, you know, that all data is segregated and destroyed, you know, upon no longer being required, things of that nature, right? So, you know, this is more and more becoming a practice where, you know, when you bring in third-party consultants and you're working with these organizations, that there's a necessity to, you know, also vet and ensure that, you know, whatever you're taking as precautions within your organization, you're doing the same towards the organizations that you engage with and work with. And in fact, in certain cases, from an insurance perspective, we've had some of the major players that we do business with ask to have their names underwritten under the contracts that we're doing in case of something happening. So have a pass-through to cover them under things that we're doing. So there's more and more of these types of things that we're seeing. But like David Leonard was saying, it's an evolving sort of market, and things are changing right now. There's a lot of new things that are coming to light, but I would definitely keep an eye on that because, you know, it is in fluctuation, let's say.
That's great additional info. Thank you, David. And Vanessa, you also want to contribute?
Yeah, if I may add, so it is going to be a legal requirement to demonstrate compliance. Bill 64, so the new legislation that is going to come soon, I suppose, into force in Quebec regarding privacy. There's specific legal requirements that says that you have to implement those policies, procedures, and stuff like that. And if you don't, there's going to be a very big fines. And we're talking about potential millions of dollars. So you're going to have to do it if you want to be compliant, you know, and manage your risks.